My name is Tyler Swampwood. I am 39 years old, and I work as a swamp camping guide for Georgia State Parks, leading camping expeditions into the Okefenokee Swamp and surrounding Pine Barrens, where I've learned that something in the dark waters views campers as prey to be dragged into the depths during the most vulnerable hours of night. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, please. I've been guiding swamp camping for 12 years throughout Georgia's vast wetland regions, teaching visitors how to camp safely in environments where alligators, venomous snakes, and treacherous water conditions create constant danger for unprepared outdoor enthusiasts. This happened last September while leading a weekend camping expedition into the remote areas of Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, where we had established our campsite on a small island platform about 3 miles from the nearest boat access point. The camping group consisted of 5 experienced outdoor enthusiasts who had specifically requested advanced swamp camping instruction in Georgia's most challenging wetland environment, where camping requires elevated platforms and constant awareness of aquatic predators. Our campsite was positioned on a natural hammock, a slightly elevated piece of dry land surrounded by dark swamp water, with our tents arranged in a defensive circle around a central fire area that provided light and psychological security against the nocturnal threats of swamp camping. Around 10 p.m., while the group was settling into their tents for the night, we began hearing sounds from the surrounding swamp water that immediately distinguished this camping experience from routine swamp expeditions I had led over 12 years of guide work. The sounds included large splashes and movement patterns in the water that suggested something much larger than normal alligator activity, with displacement of water volume that indicated creatures of enormous size moving around our isolated camping platform. Around 11 p.m., the aquatic activity escalated when something in the swamp began testing the edges of our camping platform, probing the boundaries between dry land and water with obvious intelligence about where our tents were positioned and how campers might be accessed. Sarah Mitchell, one of the experienced campers, reported feeling vibrations through the ground that suggested something massive was moving directly beneath our camping platform. Investigating the structure and testing for weak points, or areas where it might break through. Around midnight, the entity in the swamp began demonstrating supernatural abilities that elevated the threat beyond normal wildlife encounters into something that challenged basic understanding of swamp ecology and predator behavior. Janet Walsh's tent, positioned closest to the water's edge, began moving slowly toward the swamp, despite being properly staked and secured, according to standard swamp camping protocols that had prevented tent displacement during previous expeditions. The tent movement was deliberate and controlled, with the entire structure being dragged inch by inch toward the dark water, while Janet remained inside, too terrified to exit her shelter, and too helpless to stop the inexorable movement toward the swamp. Around 12:30 a.m., I realized that whatever was in the water possessed supernatural strength and intelligence, systematically targeting our camping group with predatory tactics that exceeded any known swamp creature's hunting capabilities. Working quickly, I managed to cut Janet's tent stakes and help her evacuate her shelter, just as the entity in the water made its final attempt to drag her tent completely into the swamp where she would have been trapped underwater. But the aquatic predator wasn't deterred by our intervention. Within minutes, it began targeting Mike Rodriguez's tent with the same deliberate dragging technique, demonstrating that it could systematically hunt each camper until our entire group was eliminated. The entity seemed to understand exactly how tent camping worked and knew that dragging occupied shelters into deep water would create drowning scenarios where campers would be helpless to escape once they were pulled beneath the surface. Around 1 a.m., the supernatural swamp predator escalated its assault by targeting multiple tents simultaneously, demonstrating either multiple entities working in coordination or a single creature with supernatural abilities that allowed it to manipulate several camping shelters at once. Dave Chen and Lisa Kim's tents began moving toward different areas of the water's edge, forcing our group to choose which campers to rescue first, while others were being dragged toward certain death in the dark swamp water. The coordinated tent dragging created maximum psychological terror while demonstrating tactical sophistication that exceeded normal predator behavior and suggested intelligence, specifically adapted for hunting human campers in swamp environments. Around 2 a.m., I made the decision to evacuate our entire camping expedition immediately, despite the extreme dangers of nighttime swamp travel, because remaining on the platform would result in systematic elimination of our group through tent-dragging attacks. Using emergency procedures, we abandoned our camping equipment and evacuated to our boats. But the aquatic entity pursued our evacuation convoy through the dark swamp water with aggressive behavior that continued for over an hour of nighttime navigation. During our emergency evacuation, we could hear the entity destroying our abandoned campsite, but we also observed supernatural abilities that confirmed this wasn't normal wildlife behavior, but something that specifically hunted human campers in Georgia's swamp environments. When we reached safety and reported the incident, I learned that similar tent-dragging attacks had been occurring in Georgia's swamp camping areas for decades, with consistent patterns of entities that specifically targeted camping equipment during nighttime hours. Investigation revealed that successful tent-dragging attacks had resulted in several missing campers over the years, with search operations finding camping equipment in deep swamp areas where recovery of human remains was impossible due to water conditions and predator activity. I continue guiding swamp camping because it provides unique educational experiences about Georgia's wetland ecosystems. But I now include enhanced security protocols and avoid camping on platforms that have been associated with tent-dragging incidents. Some entities in Georgia's swamp waters have developed sophisticated hunting techniques, specifically designed to capture human campers through tent manipulation, and they demonstrate intelligence that makes swamp camping far more dangerous than normal wildlife encounters would suggest. My name is Ashley Pinehart. I am 34 years old, and I work as a wilderness navigation instructor for the Georgia Forestry Commission, teaching advanced orienteering skills in the state's vast pine forest regions, where I've discovered that some areas contain supernatural forces that can manipulate navigation equipment and trap experienced hikers in endless forest mazes. I've been teaching wilderness navigation for 9 years throughout Georgia's Pine Barrens, specializing in compass and GPS navigation techniques that allow outdoor enthusiasts to travel safely through the dense pine forests that cover thousands of square miles of Georgia's landscape. This happened last November, while conducting a weekend navigation course in the Okefenokee National Forest, where I was teaching advanced compass techniques to a group of experienced hikers who wanted to master traditional navigation methods for backcountry travel. The course participants included 5 skilled outdoor enthusiasts with previous navigation experience, who had specifically requested training in areas where GPS signals were unreliable and where compass navigation skills could mean the difference between safe travel and dangerous disorientation. We entered the pine forest using established trailheads with detailed topographic maps and multiple compass bearings that should have provided reliable navigation references throughout our planned 2-day wilderness navigation exercise. Around noon on our first day, while practicing compass triangulation techniques in a dense pine forest area about 4 miles from our starting point, we began experiencing navigation anomalies that immediately distinguished this training session from routine orienteering instruction. Our compass readings started showing inconsistent magnetic directions that changed when we moved only a few feet in any direction, creating impossible navigation conditions where traditional orienteering techniques couldn't establish reliable position references. Tom Harrison, one of the most experienced participants, reported that his compass was showing magnetic north directions that rotated continuously, making it impossible to maintain consistent bearings for travel through the dense pine forest environment. Around 2 p.m., the navigation problems escalated when GPS devices also began malfunctioning, showing location readings that placed us in areas that didn't match the surrounding terrain features visible through the pine forest canopy. Jennifer Walsh's GPS unit showed coordinates that would have placed our group in a completely different part of Georgia, while satellite imagery on the device displayed forest patterns that didn't correspond to the actual pine tree arrangement around our location. The electronic navigation failures forced us to rely entirely on traditional map and compass techniques, but our compasses continued showing impossible readings that prevented accurate position determination or route planning through the forest. Around 4 p.m., we realized that whatever was affecting our navigation equipment was also manipulating our perception of the forest environment itself, creating spatial distortions that made traditional orienteering impossible, even with functional equipment. The pine forest around us seemed to be changing its layout and terrain features, while we attempted to navigate, with trails appearing and disappearing and landscape features shifting position in ways that defied basic geographic principles. Lisa Martinez reported seeing the same distinctive pine tree formation from multiple different directions during our navigation attempts, suggesting that we were traveling in circles despite following careful compass bearings and map references. Around 6 p.m., as daylight began failing, our navigation course had become a survival situation where 5 experienced orienteers and their instructor were completely lost in pine forest that shouldn't have presented navigation challenges for people with our skill levels. We attempted to backtrack to our entry point using our outbound route notes, but the forest layout had changed enough that familiar landmarks were no longer in their expected positions relative to our recorded navigation data. Most disturbing was that the pine forest seemed to be actively working against our navigation attempts, with trails leading us in directions that contradicted our compass readings and terrain features that didn't match our topographic map references. Around 8 p.m., we established emergency camp procedures and prepared to spend an unplanned night in the forest, while continuing navigation attempts using celestial navigation techniques that should have been immune to whatever was affecting our compass and GPS equipment. But even star navigation proved unreliable, with constellations appearing in incorrect positions relative to our known approximate location in Georgia, suggesting that the supernatural forces affecting our navigation equipment could also manipulate our perception of celestial references. The navigation manipulation created complete spatial disorientation that exceeded normal forest disorientation and suggested intelligent interference designed to trap people in specific forest areas for unknown purposes. Around midnight, while conducting emergency navigation attempts, we began experiencing phenomena that confirmed our navigation problems were caused by supernatural forces rather than equipment malfunctions or normal disorientation factors. The pine forest around our emergency camp showed movement patterns that suggested the trees themselves were repositioning to maintain our disorientation, with forest layout changes occurring during periods when we weren't directly observing specific areas. We also began hearing sounds that seemed designed to lead us away from our camp and deeper into forest areas where our disorientation would be complete and where rescue would be impossible, even if search teams were deployed. Around dawn, after spending a night trapped in supernaturally manipulated forest, our navigation equipment suddenly began functioning normally, showing accurate readings that allowed us to determine our actual position and plan evacuation routes. We discovered that we had been traveling in a complex pattern that kept us within a relatively small area of pine forest, despite feeling like we had covered many miles during our attempts to navigate back to safety. The supernatural navigation manipulation had been precise enough to keep us lost while preventing us from traveling far enough to encounter serious environmental dangers or move beyond potential rescue range if emergency assistance had been required. When we safely exited the forest and reported our navigation experiences, I learned that similar compass and GPS malfunctions had been documented throughout Georgia's pine forest regions, particularly in areas where dense tree cover created optimal conditions for spatial disorientation. Investigation revealed traditional knowledge from local communities about forest areas where navigation was considered unreliable and where experienced woodsmen had reported becoming lost despite superior orienteering skills and detailed knowledge of forest terrain. I continued teaching wilderness navigation because these skills are essential for safe backcountry travel. But I now include warnings about areas where navigation equipment may be unreliable and emphasize backup navigation techniques for supernatural interference scenarios. Some forces in Georgia's pine forests can manipulate both electronic and traditional navigation equipment to trap travelers in specific forest areas, and they demonstrate intelligence that makes wilderness navigation far more challenging than normal environmental factors would suggest. My name is Kevin Basswater. I am 46 years old, and I work as a fishing camp manager for the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, maintaining remote fishing facilities throughout the state's pine barrens and swamp regions, where I've learned that some abandoned fishing camps contain supernatural residents who view living visitors as unwelcome intruders in their territorial waters. I've been managing fishing camp facilities for 16 years across Georgia's diverse aquatic environments, maintaining cabins and equipment that provide base camp operations for serious fishing enthusiasts seeking access to the state's most productive and remote fishing locations. This happened last October while inspecting the Old Creek Fishing Camp, a remote facility located deep in the Altamaha River Basin, about 25 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by boat or four-wheel drive vehicle through challenging swamp terrain. The fishing camp consisted of 3 rustic cabins and a central lodge building that had been used by fishing groups for decades, but which had been abandoned for the past 2 years due to budget constraints and declining usage by recreational fishing organizations. I was conducting annual facility inspection to assess maintenance needs and determine whether the fishing camp could be restored to operational status for the upcoming fishing season, when budget limitations might be relaxed enough to resume facility operations. The camp buildings were structurally sound but showed typical signs of abandonment: cobwebs, dust accumulation, and minor weather damage that would require basic maintenance before the facilities could safely accommodate fishing groups again. Around 2 p.m., while inspecting the main lodge building, I began noticing signs that the supposedly abandoned fishing camp was being used by someone despite the fact that no permits had been issued and no authorized personnel should have access to the locked facilities. The lodge kitchen showed evidence of recent cooking activity with clean dishes, fresh food supplies, and cooking equipment arranged as if someone had been preparing meals on a regular basis during the period when the camp was supposed to be completely vacant. Fishing equipment throughout the lodge was organized and maintained in perfect condition, with tackle boxes sorted, rods properly stored, and bait supplies that appeared fresh, despite the fact that no fishing activities had been authorized at the abandoned facility. Around 4 p.m., while documenting the unauthorized usage for security violation reports, I encountered direct evidence that the Old Creek Fishing Camp was inhabited by residents who immediately challenged my presence at their territorial location. 3 figures emerged from areas of the lodge where I had already conducted inspection without seeing any signs of human presence, suggesting they had been concealing themselves until they decided to confront me about my intrusion into their fishing camp territory. The figures appeared to be experienced fishermen based on their clothing and equipment, but their behavior and appearance created immediate unease that distinguished them from normal fishing camp users, who might have been trespassing on state property. They moved with unnatural silence, despite wearing boots and carrying fishing gear that should have created normal walking sounds on the wooden floors of the fishing lodge, and they seemed to appear and disappear without using conventional entrances or exits. The phantom fishermen communicated through gestures and expressions rather than verbal conversation, but their message was clear. They considered me an unwelcome intruder in their fishing camp territory and wanted me to leave immediately. Around 6 p.m., when I attempted to assert my authority as state property manager and explain that the camp was officially closed and that they were trespassing, the phantom residents became more aggressive in defending their territorial claims. Fishing equipment began moving throughout the lodge without anyone touching it, with tackle boxes opening and closing, fishing rods being manipulated, and bait containers being arranged in patterns that seemed designed to intimidate and confuse living visitors. The phantom fishermen demonstrated detailed knowledge of fishing camp operations and territorial behavior that suggested they had been using the facility for much longer than the 2 years since official closure, possibly for decades of unauthorized residence. Around 8 p.m., the supernatural fishing camp residents escalated their territorial defense by manipulating environmental conditions inside the lodge to create uncomfortable and threatening atmosphere designed to force my evacuation from their claimed territory. Temperature inside the lodge dropped significantly despite mild October weather, creating uncomfortable cold that seemed concentrated around areas where I attempted to continue my facility inspection rather than affecting the entire building uniformly. Lighting conditions became unreliable, with electrical systems functioning sporadically and oil lamps lighting and extinguishing without manual operation, creating inconsistent illumination that made continued inspection work difficult and potentially dangerous. Around 10 p.m., I realized that the Phantom Fishing Camp residents possessed supernatural abilities that made it impossible to complete my official inspection duties while they remained actively hostile to my presence at their territorial fishing camp. I continue managing fishing camp facilities because they provide essential access to Georgia's premier fishing locations. But I now include security protocols for facilities that have been associated with phantom resident encounters and avoid solo inspections at camps with territorial entity activity. Some fishing camps in Georgia's remote areas contain phantom residents who maintain territorial claims that supersede official property management and who will defend their fishing territories against living visitors through supernatural means that make normal facility management impossible.